Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today I am going to go over another hand from my semi-deep run in the first 1500 Dealer's Choice event at this year's 2025 World Series of Poker. This hand was a very memorable hand as there were only 21 players left. We were well inside the money, and it ended up being probably one of the biggest pots I've ever played at this stage of a limit tournament in Ace to 5 Razz. Unfortunately for me, spoiler alert, this was the beginning of the end of my tournament as the hand did not work out for me and I ended up bowing out in 21st place in this event. But we're going to go through a very interesting hand. I'm also going to link you to the Poker News write-up of the hand in the description below. You can check that out because maybe it is a little easier to visualize in that way. But the hand started out innocuously enough. I limped in Ace to 5 Razz with the 7 showing and the 6-4 in the hole. Scott Bohlman on my left completed with a 6 showing. Another player re-raised with a 5 showing. And then yet another player in later position cold 3-bet, 4-bet in Razz with the 3 showing. So this is just immediately going to create a very memorable and dicey hand in a tournament situation, because what happens in Razz is that once the pot gets bloated, it can be very, very difficult to get away from your hand if you have any equity. And with this pot blowing up on 3rd Street with everyone liking their hand and feeling some incentive to jam, that's basically what happened. Really, the only point that I could have considered doing anything different in this hand probably was on 3rd Street, where with 7-6-4 and 21 players left in the field, you could make a small argument for folding, having only limped in and facing a raise, a completion, a raise, and a re-raise with a 6, a 5, and a 3 behind me. It's quite clear that there are some stronger hands out, stronger than mine pre. However, an important thing to understand about Razz is that the equities on 3rd Street do run quite close. And my hand is a little bit better than typical in this situation, given the 6-4 that I have in the hole, with one of the 6s being dead, and maybe a slight bit of deception if I catch an ace or a deuce on my board that my hand looks a little different than it is. That's not really a big consideration, though. The main fact is just that hands run fairly close on 3rd Street, and all of us just got dealt extremely playable hands, and all hell broke loose on the early street. So with that information in mind, we all called the 4-bet, and there was already something like 14 small bets in the pot with the antes. And on 4th Street, a very good situation emerges for me. I catch an 8, Scott catches a 9, the other players catch a jack and a king. And I lead right into the field, obviously betting my board, and Scott raises with his 6-9 showing. So this is sort of an interesting situation. Scott Bohlman's an extremely experienced stud player, a very good high-stakes player, and not somebody who shies away from variance in tournament situations, which I agree with in this situation. In a tournament with 21 players left, particularly in a World Series event where the payouts are very, very top-heavy and we're already inside the money, there is a lot of incentive to try to build chips. There's a lot of incentive to try to fight for pots, and getting knocked out or getting crippled at this stage of the tournament is not that big of a disaster. It is relatively flat in the payouts. And then beyond that, with this big pot brewing, Scott just correctly feels in the situation that he is pushing equity by raising on 4th Street here. And look what happens as we look at the equity here. Finally, we look over at ProPokerTools Odds Oracle, and we see my hand versus what I perceived his range to be, and the other 2 players' ranges, which were quite tight. I'm obviously doing the best, which is pretty clear. And we can see that Scott, just with his range here, is pushing something like 2% equity over par. So if all things are equal here and it's a 4-way situation, then he would need more than 25% equity to be making money on this raise. And we see that he probably is. Beyond that, he has a side benefit, which is if one of his opponents does elect to fold, he's going to profit greatly from that situation. Let's just say, for example, the 3-king board decides to fold. I don't advocate for either of my opponents, any of my opponents having folding on 4th Street here. I think actually everyone played this hand perfectly fine. What ended up happening was they both cold called. I 3-bet, Scott 4-bet. They both cold called again, and I got to cap it for 5 bets, and everyone continued. But let's just take a look if the 3-king does elect to fold, and we see how the equities jump. Obviously, I benefit the most. I have the best hand. Scott's equity increases from 26% all the way up to 33%, and of course, the other player, if he sticks around, increases a little bit too. In such a bloated pot on 3rd Street, any time where you can increase your equity by something like 7 or 8%, and he's just making money on the bets that go into the pot, right? He's not losing EV here. He's gaining EV on each bet that goes into the pot. This is a very good situation. And despite me thinking that it was a little bit high variance in the moment, having seen this back, I also think that it was a good play from Scott. Now, one other thing I will throw in there is let's also note that he could perceive my range a little differently. I'm going to change the simulation around a little bit, and instead of looking at his range, we're going to give him his exact hand, which was 5-4 in the hole. So he has 4-5, 6-9 with a dead 5, and he's perceiving my range to be, very likely 2 small cards, right? So if I have exactly the 2 small cards I'm representing, then let's see how he actually views his equity in the situation. Of course, it's an approximation. He can't really know. It turns out against that exact range with his exact hand, it's actually a little bit worse for him, but he's still pushing equity. But what about the case where I could have an 8 in the hole? Is it possible that I could pair my 8 here on 3rd Street and feel obligated to sort of jam my board because of the fact that I'm just going to be needing to continue anyway, and if I catch gin on a later street, I can then overrepresent my hand and potentially get someone to fold? I absolutely think that's possible, and it's a very reasonable assumption for Scott to make after I just limped in on 3rd Street. Look at how the equities go if I could pair the 8. This doesn't mean I do pair the 8, this just means that I could pair the 8. Now, my entire range is now actually the underdog to Scott's entire range, where he can basically never have a 9 in the hole in this situation. So, this is the view from Scott's perspective, is that sometimes I even pair the 8 in the situation. He can actually be in a great situation. So what ended up happening is obviously everyone continued, and then really the hand was not that interesting after that. I've kind of gone through the most interesting part of the hand. It was memorable after that, but I think strategically we've pretty much thought that 4th Street was really the most interesting part of the hand. What happened on 5th Street as we turn over to this next simulation was I caught complete gin. I caught a deuce, and everybody else bricked. Scott caught a 10, another player caught a 9, and the other player caught another king. So I now have a made 8 low against hands that are basically all drawing to runner, and we can see my overwhelming equity here on 5th Street in this massive pot that I looked it up after just now in doing my research, and this pot ended up being about 1.6 million chips, which at the next break, after, spoiler alert, I was eliminated in 21st place, 1.6 million chips was more than the chip leader had at that stage of the tournament. So basically whoever won this pot was going to be the chip leader of the entire tournament. So you can see that it was quite a memorable and quite an exciting hand to be a part of. I bet on 5th Street, and of course all of my opponents called, and the player with the king showing here was effectively all in actually at this stage of the tournament. So he was really just drawing to runner here. Notice that Scott really can't fold, however, here, because there is some chance that I pair the deuce at this point, right? Remember, if we turn this around and we look at his exact hand, and we look at my range here, even if I can never pair the 8, let's now just go ahead and, give me that strong range that we had before, but with no deuces exposed, how is he now doing equity-wise in a situation where, the pot is just absolutely massive, and I can absolutely pair that deuce? Well, it's not great. We can see that he's only got 12%, but given the fact that the pot now has something like 16 big bets in it already at the stage of the hand, it really would be a mistake for anyone to fold. So one player was all in, the other 2 players called me. On 6th Street, really nothing changed too much other than one of the players, the one with the Jack-9 showing, caught another brick paint card and finally elected to fold, deciding that he was drawing dead too often. I bet my board. Obviously, I could still pair the deuce in this situation, and the all-in player actually caught an ace on 6th Street in the spot, and there had been no aces exposed. So from my perspective, I actually thought that there was a decent chance that he pairs that ace, and I've just got the entire pot locked up now, because now we can see that Scott has 0% equity, having caught a brick on 6th Street, and me now having an 8 low locking him out. It turns out that the player that caught the ace went from something like 8% equity all the way up to 20% equity by catching that card. Obviously, in my mind, I was hoping that he paired the ace and I had everybody drawing dead in this absolutely massive pot. What ended up happening was, on the river, I actually improved to a 7 low by catching a 3, and I bet again, knowing that Scott needed to call for the side pot. Scott did think for a long time, realized that it would be kind of crazy for me to be bluffing in the situation, but did elect to call, and the all-in player had not looked at his last card yet, and he had not paired the ace, so that was disappointing for me, and he did indeed catch a deuce to make the winning hand on the end and win this insanely massive pot. That was a very memorable hand. This was an early test of my mental game, to be honest with you, more than the actual strategy of the hand. For me, this hand was extremely easy to play strategically. I was very proud of the way I handled it afterwards. I think that part of being deep in tournaments is realizing that there's going to be extreme volatility, and going from feeling like I had a hammerlock on this hand to losing it to the all-in player was, of course, extremely disappointing. But I had a short stack left over, and I fought a little bit longer, but unfortunately, nothing really went my way after that, and I ran out of chips. But it did portend good things to come for me later in the World Series, as I had many other deep runs, and we're going to be looking at a bunch more hands in the coming weeks on the channel here. So let me know what questions you have about this interesting Razz spot. It was definitely a memorable one to me. Go ahead and read the hand history report on Poker News if you're interested, and let me know what comments and questions you have. Thanks a lot. See you guys soon.